When Louis XIV entered adulthood, Europe regarded him as a marvel. Born in 1638 and crowned as a child, his youth had been overshadowed by the Fronde, the civil wars that taught him to distrust nobles and crowds alike. By the time he reached his early 20s, however, he had transformed from a vulnerable boy into the most dazzling monarch of his age. In 1661, after the death of his chief minister, Cardinal Mazarin, he announced that he would rule alone. It was not an empty boast, but the beginning of a carefully constructed performance of power that would hold France in awe for decades. Eyewitnesses described him in near reverent tones. His long, dark hair framed a face that seemed born for portraits, and his movements were precise and elegant. Dance became his chosen language of majesty. From his teenage performance as Apollo, the sun god, in the Ballet de la Nuit, the imagery of the Sun King had taken root, and Louis never abandoned it. Guided by his dance master, Pierre Beauchamp, he trained with the discipline of an athlete, appearing in ballets and court entertainments that merged theater, music, and monarchy. Each step reinforced the belief that order radiated outward from his body. His talents extended beyond the stage. Tutored by scholars such as Hardouin de Périfix, Louis mastered multiple languages including Spanish, Italian, Latin, and German, in addition to his native French. This skill made him a formidable diplomat. He could converse directly with ambassadors without translators, using his words as instruments of policy. Even more astonishing was his memory. He could recall the names and family connections of thousands of nobles, often surprising a courtier he had not seen in years by greeting him personally. To the nobles, this was not a trivial feat. It transformed recognition into a form of reward, binding them more tightly to the king who seemed to remember everyone. Life at court became a theater of splendor. Versailles, once a modest hunting lodge, began its transformation into a palace unlike any other. Architects such as Louis Levaux, artists like Charles Lebrun, and gardeners under André Le Nôtre joined forces to build a setting worthy of the radiant monarch. Every corridor and courtyard reinforced hierarchy. Each day began with the lever, the king's rising, in which only select nobles were permitted into his chamber to assist in dressing. To hold the royal shirt or pass him a glove was considered an honor of immense value. At night, the coucher, or retiring ceremony, repeated the ritual in reverse. Even eating became a public act. At the grand couvert, Louis dined in view of the court, while nobles vied for the right to stand close or serve his plate. What might have been private acts of bathing, dressing, or eating were transformed into sacred rituals of power, with Louis at the center of every gesture. His body itself was a tool of sovereignty. Hunting, one of his greatest passions, was more than sport. It demonstrated courage, stamina, and mastery of nature. The king's hunts could last for hours, exhausting younger courtiers who struggled to keep pace. He fenced, rode, and danced with unflagging energy, embodying vitality at a time when physical vigor was equated with legitimacy. Even his fashion served a political purpose. Heels dyed red, flowing wigs, and ornate coats amplified his presence, making him taller, more commanding, and unmistakable in any crowd. Louis's stamina seemed almost superhuman. He could hold morning councils, ride to the hunt, preside over feasts in the evening, and dance late into the night without visible fatigue. His appetite was legendary. He consumed multiple courses of meats, soups, fruits, and sweets in a single sitting. Yet the excess never seemed to slow him. To his courtiers, it was further proof that he was not an ordinary man, but someone set apart, blessed with reserves of energy beyond comprehension. Marriage and romance also played a role in his image. His union with Maria Theresa of Spain in 1660 reinforced dynastic legitimacy and symbolized the peace between two great powers. At the same time, his many mistresses, particularly Louise de la Vallière and later Madame de Montespan, shaped networks of influence at court. These liaisons, far from diminishing his authority, enhanced his reputation for virility. In an age when fertility and strength were bound to kingship, Louis's romantic entanglements confirmed his masculine potency and drew ambitious families closer to the center of power. Observers marveled not only at his brilliance, but at the system he built. Nobles who once held military power now competed for intimacy with the king. Access to Louis became the true currency of the realm, replacing swords with smiles and bows. Through ritual, memory, and constant visibility, he turned proximity into privilege. His ministers, particularly Jean-Baptiste Colbert, translated this aura into practical power by centralizing finance, trade, and the arts. Culture itself was placed in royal service. The academies of dance, painting, architecture, and letters ensured that every artistic creation reflected a single message: glory radiates from the king. Foreign envoys left Versailles reporting a prince who combined elegance with stamina, one who could dance, deliberate, and dominate in the same day. To them, Louis appeared not only as the ruler of France, but as the embodiment of monarchy itself. His subjects saw him as a star at the center of the universe, around which all things revolved. In this golden period of youth, Louis XIV shone with such brilliance that it seemed unthinkable the light could ever dim. He was, to those who witnessed him, the radiant Sun King, immortal, untouchable, and eternal. For years, Louis XIV had seemed tireless, as though his body was as eternal as his throne. But by the 1680s, whispers began to surface at court. The king's energy was no longer inexhaustible, and the first cracks in the Sun King's radiant image began to show. He was still majestic in ceremony, still commanding in council, but behind the gilded curtains of Versailles, his body was betraying him. Chronic discomfort first appeared in small, undignified ways. Constipation plagued him, making each meal, no matter how splendid, a potential source of agony. Courtiers noticed that he often shifted uncomfortably on his throne, his face tightening in pain, though protocol demanded they pretend not to see. His breath grew foul, a problem worsened by his neglect of oral hygiene. By the 1690s, his mouth was already rotting with decay, yet etiquette forbade anyone from recoiling. To sit close to the king was an honor, even if the air around him grew increasingly difficult to endure. Bathing, too, became an issue. In early modern France, water was often considered dangerous, thought to open the pores to illness. Louis, like many of his contemporaries, avoided it. Instead, he relied on linen shirts, changed frequently to absorb sweat and grime. At first this was enough, but as the years passed, the royal odor became notorious. The king himself believed his natural scent carried a kind of power, and some courtiers flattered this notion, reinforcing the belief that he did not need the cleansing rituals of ordinary men. What had once seemed an eccentricity hardened into a dangerous habit. By 1686, the consequences could no longer be hidden. The king began suffering from painful swelling near his lower body, initially dismissed as hemorrhoids. But the discomfort grew unbearable. At ceremonies, he shifted and winced, trying to maintain the composure of a god while enduring the misery of a mortal. Courtiers whispered that he could hardly sit, and when he did, the pain etched itself across his once imperious features. His doctors, sworn to protect both his health and his dignity, attempted to mask the truth. They spoke of minor ailments, nothing that could threaten the radiant image of the Sun King. Yet in private, the reality was undeniable. The swelling worsened, infections spread, and the stench that had already lingered about him deepened into something more alarming. Those closest to him faced a dilemma. Protocol demanded reverence, but proximity to the king now carried with it the ordeal of enduring his bodily decline. Etiquette silenced complaints, yet diaries and letters from the period revealed disgust, thinly veiled by loyalty. To the outside world, Louis still appeared as the unshakable monarch who had ruled for decades with unmatched authority. Inside Versailles, however, the illusion was beginning to falter. The man who had once danced as Apollo, radiant and immortal, was entering a struggle he could not choreograph away. The first signs of decline had arrived, and they would only deepen in the years to come. As the king's condition worsened, desperation crept into the chambers of Versailles. By 1686, the swelling and infection near his lower body could no longer be concealed behind polite fictions of hemorrhoids. The pain was excruciating, and the courtiers who once marveled at his radiant energy now watched their monarch shift in agony, unable to sit, stand, or walk without wincing. The Sun King, who had once embodied the vigor of youth, found himself the subject of hushed discussions in the salons and corridors of his own palace. Physicians of the day were bound more by ritual and tradition than science, and their treatments only deepened his suffering. Enemas were administered constantly, sometimes several in a single day, in a futile attempt to ease his discomfort. Hot cautery irons were applied in a brutal effort to burn away infection. Ointments, poultices, and herbal concoctions were rubbed into the king's tender flesh, all with the confident pronouncements of cure, yet nothing worked. Instead, the pain worsened, and the infection deepened. The royal body, however, was not just flesh, it was a symbol of France itself. To admit weakness was to endanger the myth of monarchy. Doctors worked frantically not only to treat the king, but to protect the aura of his invincibility. But as the weeks dragged into months, it became impossible to disguise the truth. The Sun King's ailment had become the talk of Europe. Whispers of his condition reached foreign ambassadors, who relayed back reports of the monarch reduced to grimacing and shifting uncomfortably during audiences. In the end, there was no choice but to attempt surgery, a decision that terrified everyone involved. Surgery in the 17th century was a last resort, a brutal business performed without anesthesia, antiseptics, or reliable instruments. The task fell to Charles-François Félix, a barber surgeon of some reputation, though hardly of the stature befitting such a patient. Félix, understanding the stakes, spent months preparing. He practiced his technique on prisoners dragged from jails, opening their bodies, cutting, probing, stitching, all to perfect the operation that would soon be performed on the most powerful man in Europe. When the moment finally came, Louis XIV faced the ordeal with a kind of stoic dignity that astonished his court. Laid out before his surgeon, fully conscious, he endured an operation so painful that witnesses could scarcely describe it. Blades cut into infected flesh, pus and blood spilled, and the king's groans filled the chamber. Courtiers fainted, doctors trembled, yet Louis himself gritted his teeth and survived what seemed impossible. The procedure revealed a fistula, a deep tunnel of infection that no amount of poultice or prayer could erase. The surgeon worked tirelessly, cutting and cauterizing, yet the wound never fully healed. Félix's name became famous overnight. His success in keeping the king alive was celebrated in medals, poems, and portraits. But beneath the triumph lay a harsher truth. Louis XIV's body had been permanently altered. The Sun King carried a wound that would never fully close, a reminder that even the most glorious monarch could not escape the frailties of flesh. Versailles rejoiced at his survival, yet the legend of immortality had been pierced. The operation had saved his life, but it had not restored him to health. The fistula remained, an open wound that refused to heal, and it marked the beginning of years of torment. Infection lingered, pain returned again and again, and the monarch who once seemed made of iron was now visibly weakened. Yet Versailles was not a place where weakness could be admitted. The king had to remain the Sun King, radiant and immortal, no matter what his body was becoming. And so the greatest performance of his reign began, the performance of pretending that nothing was wrong. The reality was hard to ignore. The smell of the king's body grew overwhelming. Even after surgeries and endless attempts at cleansing, the odor of infection clung to him. Perfume became the court's constant companion. Versailles, already famous for its gardens of roses and fountains scented with orange blossoms, was drowned in clouds of ambergris, musk, and lavender. Nobles arriving for the lever or the coucher carried perfumed handkerchiefs not only as a mark of refinement, but as a shield against the miasma that spread from the royal chamber. Louis's teeth began to decay until, one by one, they were lost. Chewing became agonizing, and his once commanding voice was altered by the gaps in his mouth. His jaw collapsed slightly inward, changing the contours of his face. Yet painters continued to render him as the ideal Apollo, untouched by time. His body swelled with weight as years of heavy meals and reduced activity took their toll. The elegant dancer of Versailles was now a bloated figure, whose once graceful movements had stiffened into ritualized steps. Still, at ceremonies, the courtiers bowed and applauded as though nothing had changed. Maintaining the illusion required elaborate choreography. The Sun King could no longer be presented as a vigorous youth, so the court devised new rituals to emphasize majesty rather than vitality. His entrances and exits were timed to conceal his infirmities. Audiences were shortened to reduce the strain, but their pomp was amplified to remind all who attended that this was still the living embodiment of France. Madame de Maintenon, his second wife, played a critical role, ensuring that the king's dignity remained intact even in moments of agony. She managed the flow of visitors, arranged diversions, and kept the machinery of ritual moving when the king himself could barely move at all. Yet the courtiers were not blind. Diaries, letters, and memoirs of those who attended Versailles in these years speak of the terrible odor and the mask of majesty that clung to the ceremonies. To sit close to the king was both an honor and a punishment. His smile, once magnetic, revealed rotting gums. His breath carried such stench that foreign envoys braced themselves before stepping into his presence. And still they came, bowed and flattered, because proximity to the monarch meant proximity to power. The paradox was striking. The man was decaying, but the myth remained untouchable. Versailles itself became the mask, covering the failing body of the king with fountains, mirrors, music, and gold. The courtiers, who once delighted in his radiant presence, now participated in a vast conspiracy of silence, sustaining the illusion that the Sun King still shone as brightly as ever. Behind the perfume, behind the ceremonies, behind the painted portraits, a man was rotting alive. But before the eyes of France and Europe, he remained the sun. By the year 1715, Louis XIV was nearing the end of his astonishing 72-year reign, but his body was betraying him in the most horrifying way. What had begun decades earlier with fistulas, infections, and endless medical torments now spiraled into something even more dreadful: gangrene. It started in his leg, a blackening of the flesh that crept upward, gnawing away at the king who had once been hailed as immortal. Doctors clustered around him in Versailles, whispering consultations that offered little hope. Amputations were discussed, but at his age, with his weakened state, the procedure would have been nothing more than a cruel prolonging of agony. Louis himself seemed to understand this. The man who had once danced across marble halls for hours without tiring was now confined to his bed, grimly aware that his own body was consuming him from within. Despite the unrelenting pain, he continued to cling to his royal role. Even in his final weeks, the king received visitors, gave audiences, and made decisions of state. Courtiers entered his chamber to find him barely recognizable, a shrunken and grotesque figure whose body was dissolving before their eyes, yet they were still required to bow and address him with reverence. They tried to focus on his words, on the authority that still rang in his commands, rather than on the fetid air that filled the room. Perfume could not mask the smell of rotting flesh. It seeped through velvet curtains, lingered in the tapestries, and forced attendants to discreetly press scented cloths to their noses as they fulfilled their duties. On September 1st, 1715, the Sun King finally died, After weeks of agony so intense that even hardened courtiers wrote of it with horror, his body, wasted by disease, collapsed into death at the age of 76. But even death brought no peace. Within hours, the corpse began to decay rapidly, as though the rot that had plagued him in life had been waiting for release. The stench grew unbearable. Accounts describe how the body swelled and blackened, forcing attendants to hastily prepare the remains for burial. When the funeral procession finally moved, the spectacle was macabre. The great Sun King, once radiant and untouchable, was reduced to a decomposing husk that horrified all who saw it. And yet, even in this grim finale, the myth of Louis XIV did not crumble. Versailles had been built not merely as a palace, but as a theater of power, and that theater endured. Official portraits, chronicles, and rituals of mourning transformed his death into a grand narrative of dignity and divine authority. The reality, a man undone by infection, reeking and collapsing into dust, was quietly pushed aside. To the public, he remained the magnificent ruler who had embodied France, the monarch who centralized power, who dazzled Europe with culture and spectacle, who made his court the envy of kings. His death, however, served as a cruel reminder of what no crown could shield against. Absolute power could bend nobles, direct armies, and build glittering palaces, but it could not conquer the slow and humiliating collapse of the human body. Louis XIV's legacy was immense. He left behind an image of monarchy that shaped Europe for generations. But his final years and his gruesome end whispered a truth that Versailles had worked so hard to silence: that even the Sun King could rot, and that beneath the gold perfume and ceremony he was flesh mortal and corruptible like any other man.